Hi, and welcome to this edition of In Conversation With, a series of programs presented by the Council of State Archivists that focuses on contemporary issues shaping the work of state archives and records programs. My name is Ann Ackerson, and I serve as the Communications and Development Coordinator for the Council. We're delighted that the series this year is being supported by our corporate sponsor, Atlas Systems. So thank you very much for that. Over the course of this year, the conversations are going to focus on three very broad topics. The first being diversity and inclusion. The second about the workplace here and now. And the third is the future of the workplace and of work in general. So I'm joined today by Mark Puente, Associate Dean for Organizational Development, Diversity and Inclusion at Purdue University Libraries and School of Information Studies. And we're going to be discussing a range of issues related to diversity and inclusion in libraries and archives. So thank you so much for being here, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Diversity and inclusion is a huge topic, but before we jump into it, I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey and what brought you to your current position and why you have centered diversity and inclusion in your work.
So great. Yeah. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about my story and my work. Like a lot of people who come into the work of archives, libraries, cultural heritage organizations, my route was pretty circuitous. I was a music educator for 13 years. And even before then, I actually went to a small Catholic all-boys boarding school in Southern Illinois, back when the woolly mammoth roamed the earth. And I was just reflecting on this the other day, that I was actually the assistant to our school librarian, a tiny little nun with a thick German accent. Ironically, her name was Sister Helen Pages. True story. But anyway, but I got I guess a more in-depth view of what libraries did just as we were entering the digital age, when I was a graduate assistant to a music librarian when I was getting my first master's degree in music. And I remembered at that time, oh goodness, you know, if music and music education don't quite work out, this libraries thing might be an interesting thing, right? And so I thought, and so I did. I taught for 13 years, decided I needed to do something else. Did the calculus on, okay, do I go get my doctorate in music, and then if you're lucky, end up as an assistant professor somewhere, or more likely cobbling together an existence by several adjunct positions simultaneously, for how many years. Or do this library thing. And so I think one of the biggest commitment to me, it comes out of the fact that I'm a beneficiary of a lot of organizational and association efforts to diversify the profession. I was a Spectrum Scholarship recipient, the ALA Spectrum Scholarship, American Library Association Spectrum Scholarship. I attended the Knowledge River program at the University of Arizona in Tucson, which has a program that focuses specifically on the recruitment of people who identify as Latinx or Hispanic and or Native American heritage into the library profession. And in fact, my first post Master of Library and Information Science position was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where I was in a 2-year term. Back then we called it minority residency program. We don't call these experiences that anymore. So part of this was just a desire to give back. I started my work in a professional level. I mean, I had been involved in diversity and inclusion work sort of as an avocation or, as work adjacent to my professional. I thought I was going to be a music librarian for the rest of my career, right? You see how well that worked out. So my last library position prior to Purdue was at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I was the coordinator for gift and special collections and archives and digital projects for the Music and Performing Arts Library. So I was through some leadership development experiences and through my engagement with professional associations, I became more and more involved in diversity work. And I was recruited out of Illinois. I wasn't looking for a change in career, but I was recruited out of there to work for the Association of Research Libraries, which, and I was in that role for more than 11 years. So I come to this work not as an expert in that work. I am entirely self-trained in terms of theories, frameworks, approaches, that sort of thing. Yeah, I was a music librarian and archivist. But things, of course, have changed a great deal in the last decade, certainly just in the last 3 years, 4 years. The tenor of that conversation has been so completely different. And most importantly, I've seen the impact. I've seen the impact of these commitments, again, both on organizational and institutional levels, on both individual lives, on the career, on the profession, so the impact is it's hard to walk away from it when you see such benefit. And not that it's perfect, and not that where we need to be, but the work has been extremely gratifying and rewarding and fulfilling.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. So from your perch now in academia,
Yeah.
what do you see as the state of diversity and inclusion efforts in iSchools, for example?
Yeah. So I don't think it's any different in iSchools than it is in other organizational or institutional contexts. Obviously, people have been critical. I think it's fair to say, and rightfully so, that so many organizations and institutions have looked to diversity recruitment as the strategy, sort of the panacea that's going to get us a more diversified workforce, more diversified collections, all these sorts of things, better descriptive practices, these sorts of things. I think iSchools, other organizations and institutions, fairly recently have come to a realization that we really need to be thinking about other things. We need to be thinking about the climate. We need to be thinking about organizational culture. We need to be thinking about the things that have been maintaining the status quo. And I mean, if we look at, just as one metric, the representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the workforce, right? In the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've been able to do nothing more than maintain stasis in terms of the numbers. Now, with the caveat here that those numbers are not, they're imperfect. We're looking out, we look at outdated census classifications to tell a story about the degree to which we are not a diversified profession, and I think there are many shortcomings to that. So that said, I think that's one big thing. We need to really concentrate on why it is that, at least by one measure, people of color in particular, seem to be leaving the profession as quickly as we're recruiting them, or at the same rate at which we're recruiting them into the profession. The other thing, of course, that I have to mention is that, especially, I mean, and it's not only been a phenomenon of since May 20th of last year, but there has been a dramatic shift in emphasis away from the sort of, I'll say, the big bucket diversity emphasis. Not that issues around accessibility, LGBTQI issues, certainly, gender equity and these sorts of things are not important, but there has certainly been a growing and heightened awareness around racial equity and emphasis around racial equity. And I think we are all living through that right now.
Right. Would you say that a couple of things. The first is about the pipeline itself. Would you say that it's any more robust now than it was 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think robust maybe is not what it is. I think that
strong word.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think about things like ALICE, the Association of Library and Information Science Education, if we look at their statistics, we've seen incremental growth in again, the representation of minoritized populations, right? Those that we traditionally think of, Black, Indigenous, Native, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, and all those sorts of things, categories. But it's been incremental, right? There haven't been dramatic shifts, not lining up with the broader population, for certain. I do think that there have been some investigations that have been interesting with respect to representation. For example, Ithaca S&R did a survey, a demographic study a couple of years ago in academic libraries, and of course the members of the Association of Research Libraries were the institutions that responded more heavily to that. But what they found out, and which exists, those data exist in other platforms like the such as data that are collected by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics,
right,
that really most of the diversity that we find is at employment levels. If we think about them, and I don't like thinking about them as in a hierarchical sort of sense, but if we think about representation, that there is much more diverse representation in whatever classification, staff levels, paraprofessionals, I don't like that word either. So those who are not, Master of Library Information Science or comparably credentialed, sorts of positions. So most of the diversity is there. Most of the growth has been there. I do think that there's been an effort to, and some success in recruiting from those populations, encouraging, staff people, as an example, to pursue library degrees and other credentialing. And I think there have been some modest successes there. So growth, modest. Of course, the lens through which I often view this is through the Association of Research Libraries. I mean, it's a small sample of 125, 126 of the largest research libraries in the United States and Canada. And at least looking at representation of the 99 US college and university libraries, there actually has been, I think, significant growth in terms of the numbers of folks from minoritized populations. So, if you look at the percentage, it doesn't look too impressive. I mean, in the last 20 years, it's gone from 11% to 15%. But if we look at the raw numbers, it's actually been fairly significant. I think that's a metric that frankly is promising, and maybe that is contrary to most of the other metrics we have.
Well, you did mention that you feel that there are as many people, BIPOC people, leaving the profession as coming in, so that on balance there hasn't been a lot of movement.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think is the reason behind people leaving the field.
Yeah.
Complicated.
It is. It's terribly complicated. I think that well, if we hear stories, if we take the time to listen to stories, and there have been a lot that are circulating. There are many stories of mistreatment, of people feeling that they're passed up for opportunities, particularly people of color. BIPOC populations are passed up for leadership opportunities. Misunderstandings, misinterpretations of, cultural dynamics, cultural mores. I mean, it's a lot about the experience within the institutions, I think. And this is, I can't point to any empiricism here. Well, actually, that's not true. There's some data out there. Scholars like Katrina Kendrick Davis are publishing about the experiences of people in different professional sectors. And there's my cat, so sorry if that's disruptive. They've been publishing about the experiences of people who work within the profession, who tell very unfortunately fraught tales about how they have been treated, both by coworkers and by patrons, quite frankly. I mean, how many How many times do we hear stories about,
Yeah.
two people at a service desk, right? A black person and a white person, and the tendency that the patrons have to go to the person who identifies as white. Even if, for example, the black person is like a credentialed, right, card carrying librarian with skills and knowledge that may be more helpful, but their expertise is ignored, in favor of the patron engaging with the white staff person. We've heard so many stories about that. So there is that. I mean, what not, and we have to honor those stories, and we have to take those stories and understand that data for what it's worth, which is a lot, for. But we also have to understand that I've also, in my previous role, have counseled people who were anticipating exits, out of the field, who unfortunately, at least in two instances that I can think of, people came back to me later and said, I'm having the same experiences, in the corporate sector or in K through 12 and that sort of thing. So these things point to these problems being systemic, rather than, necessarily exclusive. Now, the tricky part is that we sell a profession that, is rooted in, egalitarianism. I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Sort of thing.
And equity and,
yeah.
Right. And if people come into the profession with that image, and thinking that this is going to be, a wonderful workplace, and it is for so many people, but it's still challenging for so many. Right?
For sure. Yeah. I don't know if the library community has this, has these kind of things on social media, but I can tell you that in the museum sector, there's a very active Instagram account called Change the Museum, which is an anonymous post, a way for people to post everything from microaggression to major issues of discrimination in the workplace.
Right.
And it's pretty active. And so I imagine that that's true.
Exactly. It's all over the place, all over social media, of course.
Right. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. For people to share those stories, and also to signal to people that this is my daily reality. This is what I deal with. I mean, that's one thing that I will say, having come up. I'm from a generation, and where sort of it was the expectation that I was going to assimilate, right? I mean, that was the only way. My parents, both working class backgrounds and that sort of thing, and they saw education, right, and just assimilation as the path to greater economic prosperity for me and for my two brothers, right? So that's why my name is Mark Anthony Puente and not Marco Antonio Puente, because we were embracing this U.S. culture, and so I think that people are understanding more really how detrimental that can be, and that makes me better able to navigate quote unquote white spaces, right? So and that is not a luxury that many other people have. If we think about phenotypical attributes, I don't think I have to worry about being stopped by police for no reason, while I'm driving, right? I don't think I have to worry about that. Maybe in some communities I would, but growing up, I grew up a fairly, like I said, working class, but in my working life, I've lived a fairly middle class existence. So it's just again a luxury that I know that I have had, and part of my charge has really been to immerse myself in these communities, because, like I said, there are people who experience these microaggressions, a half a dozen, if not more times a day, right? And it's the cumulative impact of that.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe I do experience those things, but I've just, learned to ignore it and just, don't give it the time of day. I don't know. But I think more likely that I walk with a certain amount of privilege that, both my maleness and, whatever small percentage of me is from my colonial Iberian heritage. I think I look more indigenous than I do, Western European, but nevertheless, I think that the fact that I speak fairly Midwestern, unaccented English and that sort of thing, and so unfortunately, that just engenders a type of interaction that were it anything else, I could possibly be subject to those sorts of microaggressions as frequently as so many people in our profession do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I think we are really at to use the overused word, inflection.
Yeah, absolutely.
But recently in a meeting about something completely not related to this subject, but it did come up about microaggression and discrimination in the workplace, and someone, I guess a baby boomer, said, this younger generation isn't going to stand for it. They're not, and they speak out and speak
exactly
up.
Right. Yep.
And we're seeing that in so many platforms, virtually and at meetings and all sorts of things. So it's a good thing, I think. It's a good thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a good thing. It's a challenging thing.
It's a challenge.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't, yes, I navigate through several spaces. I have been, a lot of the sort of my formation, particularly around Racial Equity Institute, at Racial Equity has been through my involvement as a consumer of training through an organization out of Greensboro, North Carolina called the Racial Equity Institute. And I've participated in, they do some caucusing, the alumni, they have a people of color caucus and they have a white person's caucus to give people opportunity to, just to build community and to process through things and that sort of thing. And I participated a number of times, especially since Zoom, because I had access through Zoom that I didn't when they were largely in person. But those experiences, you hear people who, I'm a cusper in terms of my generation. And so I really wasn't old enough to remember the civil rights movement, particularly during the 60s.
Yeah.
But I've heard some older people in those spaces reflect on the fact that this current movement feels very much like it did in Martin Luther King's day, and in certain ways it seems different. I mean, as in some of them are hopeful that maybe this is a moment that substantive systemic change maybe can happen. But as with any change movement, the closer you get to affecting that change, the harder people are going to push back. And so that complicates this quite a bit.
Absolutely. What we've been talking about really does kind of segue into my next question for you, and that's something that came up when we were chatting earlier in a previous call about the difference between recruiting for diversity and creating workplaces that are actually conducive for BIPOC folk to actually grow and develop in their jobs and want to stay in a place rather than leave it. And I was wondering if you could shed some additional light on that thought.
Yeah, I think, and sorry, I have a visitor here. I think that it's just lunchtime. If I had the answer to that question, Anne, just a couple of reflections. I mean, I think these things are very contextual, highly contextual, right? I think that creating an inclusive environment for an institution at NYU as an example is going to look very, very different than what inclusivity and equity looks like at my institution at Purdue University in north central Indiana. Those things are very, very different. I think that I think I go to Malcolm Gladwell, and I know a lot of people may just kind of giggle if talk about popular literature like this, but I reflect on the tipping point, and the metric that we really need 3/4 of an organization or an institution or a group of people to be committed to something for there to be a significant change, right? And my issue and my charge is, okay, how do we get us to that tipping point? And it's not that 100% or that the 75% of the population is going to have the same level of awareness. They're not going to have the same theoretical underpinning and that sort of thing, but they'll at least be interested in, they'll be committed to, they will be open to exploring, what substantive, what structural barriers look like, right?
Right.
And so, that's my question is how do we get to that? I think that, if I can, both institutions, if I can talk about both ARL as an institution and Purdue University as an institution, that at major leadership levels, we have leaders that, at least in the ARL context, are much more committed, right? And much more dedicated, and really want this to be core to their mission, and that they understand that without this, that we're just like I said, maintaining the status quo, right? That the systems of advantage are to flip it. The systems of disadvantage that have existed for literally centuries for communities of color are never going to be flipped on their head if we don't have that level of commitment. So it's the work is hard. There is not a destination point. I can never imagine us getting to a point. This is ongoing work, and we have to be committed to it. And we also have to be able to and willing to pivot, because again, this work, when I started at ARL more than 10 years ago, looked very different than what it looks like now, right? The language has changed, our approaches have changed, everything has changed about it. So I think that like anything else, if we think about the functional, the practice of archives, libraries, the degree to which we need to be change ready is profound, right? And that is true of this space as well.
Yeah. Change ready.
Yeah. Right.
So important and so hard.
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially within entrenched organizational cultures sometimes.
Exactly right. Exactly
makes
right.
it difficult for change agents to move the needle. But as you say, that keeping in mind that tipping point idea, where you don't need 100%,
right,
but you do need the majority
mm-hmm.
to somehow see their way forward and support the efforts of leadership to make it happen. And maybe it's the leader who is the entrenched one, and then how
that could be true too. Right.
Actually, create space for diversity and inclusion within a department.
Exactly.
Is it possible?
Yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah. And there are many people that are, of course, in that position where this is not a priority necessarily for the titular leader of the organization or the institution. And there are people that it's like any calculus, right? I mean, you have to weigh the benefits of working for that organization, that institution. And most importantly, I mean, I think it's a values check. You know, does this organization or does this work align with my values? And yes, I can tell you, I mean, anecdotally, of course, but I can tell many stories about people who have been in situations where the answer to that was no. And they made the choice to leave the organization, in some instances to leave the profession, in order to become embedded in elsewhere, you know, where there was better alignment with their values. I mean, the values thing is absolutely critical to this, right? I mean, it's huge. But, you know, and I mean, one of the struggles, of course, is that so many people view these issues as political in nature, or at least take the opportunity to politicize these things. And that's one thing that I have struggled with over the course of my career. I mean, I grew up in a very Catholic family, right? That you know, the Latinx community is not necessarily known for being the most progressive, you know, socially, and that sort of thing. And yet, you know, issues around inclusion or issues around equity, you know, this was lived experience of particularly my parents, you know, my grandparents. And I actually think there's opportunity in terms of values alignment with those who consider themselves conservative, you know. And that's a conversation that nobody is having. Because I actually, like I said, I mean, I think in terms of honoring people, honoring the struggles, the daily struggles, and the historical struggles, you know, that people have gone through for generations upon generations. I mean, if people would just sit down and be willing to listen to that type of analysis, I think people would be more open to the conversation. Yeah.
You know, lots of institutions have values statements or statements about institutional values or guiding principles and so forth. And I do think that those are critical to really, they're critical to mission impact, but they're and they're critical just to sort of the daily interactions that take place in a workplace. And yet I do wonder how often they're talked about and referred to. But it seems to me that they're even more important than the mission statement or what's written in the strategic plan. It's really the core values that the institution holds dear and wants and expects
Absolutely
everyone working there to share in those values.
Yeah, and again, is it really that the value system has changed, or is it that we are interpreting those values in a different way, right? I mean, if we look at, for example, at Purdue University, we're a land grant institution, right? So our mission is to the citizens of Indiana, right? It's to the right, and when we think about that, well, okay, we have a growing African-American, we have a growing Black population in the state of Indiana. You know, one of the least diverse states in the country, still is growing in diversity, right? If we in representation. And so, you know, if we take the land grant, well, we can talk about the land grab in a different conversation, right? About how that came to be, stealing land from indigenous populations. But anyway, who didn't have a construct of land ownership. But anyway, that's a different story. But you know, if we are to remain consistent with that mission, then we have to think about the population that we're serving. And yes, that is inclusive of the growing Black and Latinx populations that within the state of Indiana. So we have to be better prepared to serve those communities, right? Absolutely. So, you know, again, is it, you know, I'm not sure that the values are changing, but certainly, you know, the interpretation, the application may be is a more correct way of saying that, is something that we have to be mindful of.
Well, and certainly for government agencies like state archives, their values are around serving the public.
Exactly.
There's that doesn't mean that everyone working in an archives knows or understands the public that they're supposed to be serving.
Right, right,
And
exactly.
well, it's, I don't know, it seems like it's kind of a vicious cycle, but
Sure,
um,
sure. And when we think about the sort of the artifacts, the stuff that we deal
yeah,
with, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And how that is changing, right? I mean, not only from analog to digital, but I mean,
Right.
if we think about cultural expression, if we talk about
Mhm,
um, again, I'm a recovering music librarian and music archivist, right? And I
mhm,
was trained in a Western tradition.
mhm,
I mean, my expertise is in Western opera.
mhm,
It's ridiculous to think that modern idioms and expressions shouldn't be honored and collected and curated and described in mindful and respectful ways in the way the heritage of traditional Western music was,
mhm,
right? I mean,
mhm,
it's just not, uh, they are the same thing. They are the same type of cultural expression, and again, there are implications, right? And this again is where
that's right.
having diversity within our workforce brings it brings value in terms of perspectives,
Mhm,
in terms of cultural awareness and sensitivity of how to curate materials, how to describe materials. I mean, who has access to these materials? So all of these things are considerations where that relevance piece of it is so needed, right? Yeah. Right.
So what are your thoughts or advice to organizational leaders for the types of skills that they should be nurturing now?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the hardest of all of your questions. Yeah. I would say two things. Well, a couple of things. I would say dedicate yourself to your own development.
Mm,
Right. I mean, it's important for people, even with the obstacles, the organizational, institutional, structural obstacles that people will face when trying to effect change in this realm. It's important for people to have a basic understanding of why things are the way they are. Why the underrepresentation, right? Um, um, and so I think that's part of it. The other thing that I would emphasize is to give space for the people who are newer to our profession. They're not necessarily
mhm,
young, maybe they're just young to the profession, but the ones who are extremely passionate about this work, right?
mm,
Um, and this is both connected to this, but also it has implications elsewhere. There is a real tendency, it's a natural human tendency to hoard power, right?
yes.
To kind of collect power, hold on to the power, hold on to resources. And in order to effect change, we have to be willing to let some of that go.
Mhm,
We have to be willing to share power. We
mm,
have to be willing to share resources. We have to be willing to give people the resources that they need to be successful in these efforts, right? Um, I think those are really important. The other thing is that
yeah.
okay, I'll tell you a story I mean, just a piece of advice that I share with my current dean, who is the best dean in the world, the best boss in the world. And I'm not saying that to ingratiate myself with her, but I tell her all the time, Beth, think about this as building capacity. I cannot do the work alone,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Our council on diversity, equity, and equity, inclusion, and belonging cannot do the work on its own. She cannot do the work on her own. This has to be a collective effort, and what we want to do is build throughout the organization, build the enthusiasm, build the expertise. One thing that I'm focusing on right now is to build the facilitation expertise
mm,
to be able to hold these difficult, often difficult, but courageous, necessarily courageous conversations. So we're trying to figure out how to build that capacity throughout the organization, and with the hope that then that will eke out, right? That will expand out into to the broader institution in such a way that our libraries, our archives, our press, because that's included in under our the library's umbrella, and also we have a unit, our Office of Undergraduate Research. So all of those pieces of who we are that we call libraries will be able to support broader institutional, if not, civic and societal efforts in this area.
Mhm, mhm. Are there some associations or institutions that you could point us to who you think are doing some really good work in this space?
Yeah, yeah. I think most of the traditional sort of, library archival organizations are really trying to do, ramp up the work here, make this
Mhm.
central. I mean, I just attended virtually, of course, the Association of College and Research Libraries conference. And I will tell you, equity, diversity, and inclusion was front and center. There were
Yes.
so many programs, right? I've seen that at SAA with growing, just a growing piece of that pie. The Association of Research Libraries as a collective. I mean, I think there are lots of organizations that are really trying to change. There are a couple of possibly exemplars. Whether the leaders and members of these organizations would consider themselves exemplars is another question. But I'm watching carefully the work that UNC Chapel Hill is doing as the library is. And I can't remember the name of it. I think it's a reckoning initiative, particularly looking at racial equity and the history of racial inequity, particularly in North Carolina, particularly as has been reflected in an institutional, context of that institution.
Right.
Ironically enough, just down the road at UNC Chapel Hill. I just said that, North Carolina State. I'm sorry, at North Carolina State University. They've been doing some really interesting things as well with respect to staff development. The Racial Equity Institute that I referenced earlier, they got, I believe, a campus level grant to send anybody who works in their libraries who supervises another person or another group, or a group of people. They've sent all of them to the Racial Equity Institute, and they're trying to build on that experience and build a sort of community of practice, right? Build an ongoing cohort. There have been some really interesting things in the public library space. There have been some, around Seattle, I think Hennepin County in Minnesota. Have been engaged with a group called, oh gosh, I always get this wrong, the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, GARE, G-A-R-E, that have been doing a lot of work with civic organizations and getting, civic entities engaged and dedicated to this work also. There are lots more than that.
Lots going on everywhere.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly see it across the arts and cultural spectrum as well, too. It's
AAM, has been really interesting. They have, oh gosh, there was a publication that came out a few years ago called Facing Change, I think, if I'm remembering that correctly, and they were able to get phenomenal level of funding to create sort of a fellowship program looking at diversity and focusing, I think, in certain geographic areas.
It's at the board level.
Yes. Yeah.
That work is being focused. I think it still goes on. I think it's with 50 institutions, the boards of 50 institutions.
That sounds right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very exciting work.
Yeah, very exciting, but it's also intimidating in terms of if we think about scale, right?
Right. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and also the degree to which, again, unfortunately, it's the organizations and the institutions that have the resources, both the human and financial capital to make these things happen. But what about the small rural library? What about the small historical you know, entity that doesn't have tons of staff? You know, how can they engage? And that's one of the things that concerns me about.
Well, don't you think that this is as much about mindset as it is about financial resources and community partnerships and stuff? If you don't have leadership that has that understands the importance of these issues,
Yes.
you could
Yes.
throw thousands of dollars at something and it's not necessarily
Absolutely.
going to do a darn bit of good.
Right. Absolutely. And that's what I tell people all the time. You know, it's there can be just the most fantastic, you know, grassroots movement going, but you're absolutely right. If you don't have a supportive leader, right, um, more often than not, those movements are not going to go anywhere. Unfortunately, they're just not going to have the impact that they need to have. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. So, yeah,
I mean, you know, small changes could be made certainly, but it seems to me that
absolutely. Yeah,
if leadership is just, if their heads are not there, if their heads aren't in the game,
right. Yeah.
then at some point you're going to hit a wall,
Yes.
and it's
Right.
going to be
Right.
really hard to get over it or around it, or under it
Absolutely.
or whatever needs to.
And this is why I think it's so critical. You know, the other trend that I'm seeing, of course, which is I think very positive, is yeah, I'm still engaged with many leadership development programs. With my first in-person post-pandemic sort of experience is going to be out. I'll be flying out to Washington D.C. in a few weeks to co-facilitate some conversations on this topic for the Leading Change Institute. I'm still the director of ARL's Leadership and Career Development Program. I've been on the sort of faculty, if you will, for the OSL, the Health Sciences Libraries Leadership
Mhm.
Fellows Program. And all of those programs are being much more deliberate about
Mhm.
incorporating these sorts of discussions and related content into their leadership development,
Mhm.
sort of strategy. And I think that's critical. I think it's absolutely critical. Um, yeah, because as you say, if there aren't commitments at that level, then change is going to be way more than just an uphill battle, right? Yeah.
Right, and I'm thinking about funders too,
Hmm.
although this is, well, some government archives do take advantage of outside funding for various initiatives through their Friends
Right.
programs and so forth.
Right.
Um, but it seems as though funders hold a great deal of power in
They
that
indeed do.
they
Yeah.
can really force organizations to do things.
Right. Right.
They may
Right.
not stick ultimately, but
Sure.
you
Sure.
know, I've certainly seen that happen to the good. And I think that funders, for all their faults, um, have the potential to really move these conversations forward, move action forward. And they're
Right.
doing that, certainly.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I think so. I think I was on well, I was an attendee at the ACRL conference, and people were having this discussion. I always get that question, where are there nodes of excellence? Is there
yeah.
are there people who are doing this right? And particularly around the racial equity piece of this, but there are some really compelling stories from philanthropy, right? Of some organizations that have significantly shifted their giving
Look at
priorities,
Ford.
right? Exactly. Ford, I mean, Mellon, MacArthur, there's so many. Now, the uber ironic, the uber irony there, right? That our system of capitalism that has in many ways created, and sustained the inequities are allowing, right? These extremely wealthy organizations and institutions
Mhm,
that allow that giving, right? I mean, it's
mhm.
just the irony of it is mind-boggling. Uh, but nevertheless, I mean, it's an opportunity. It is an opportunity.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that is one thing, and that I don't. If we think about an individual institution, if we think about an association, right? If we think, you know, how much change can any one organization or institution or association make? And so that's why I love this framing around collective impact, right? I mean, if we think about these big, seemingly intractable problems, right? None of this is going to happen without collective impact. So we need to think boldly about not only cross-sector, whatever collaborations. I mean, we need to think, libraries, archives need to think about collaborations with civic organizations. We need to think about collaborations with health and human services, with hospitals. I think if we think about and be very creative about those sorts of collaborations, possibly is where we're going to see that needle move in a significant way. That's one of the pushbacks, right? The way people push back. Well, what does policing have to do with libraries and archives? And if we don't really sit on the interconnectedness of all of this, we are missing out on a tremendous opportunity, right? Because they are interconnected pieces. It's just not easy to see, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think, again, when we think about philanthropy and funders, I would love to get us to that conversation.
Right. And certainly governments have a role, and a very important
Absolutely.
play, a leadership role, actually.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I know within governments, many state governments, agencies don't necessarily talk to one another, in their silos and so forth. And of course, state archives kind of bridges across all of the state agencies because they're collecting material from all of them. They could possibly be a bridge, despite the fact that they're underfunded and in many cases not respected.
Yeah.
They don't get the respect they deserve.
Right.
But, it's you're right. I mean, everybody's got to be at the table.
Right. Yeah. It's just like my institutional context, which is completely understandable. Everybody has to be responsive to their stakeholders. I mean, that is completely understandable, right? What that means, though, is that we've got all of this activity that is not connected, seemingly disparate, right? Efforts that and I think that we could, if we can find a way to partner better, right? To leverage different expertise, different approaches. I mean, all that sort of thing. I really do think that could help us in the end be more successful. So it exists at every level, right?
It sure does. And that's a great note to end our conversation. I appreciate time with you, Mark. It's always great to talk with you, and
likewise, Anne.
Hear what you're up to and get an insight into what you're thinking about and working on and that sort of thing. And I know that our state archives, our audience will, I'm sure, learn lots of things from this conversation.
I hope so.
Appreciate it.
I do hope so. Thank you. Well, thank you for reaching out. Thank you for initiating the conversation. And I'm, would love to follow up at any time. So
thank you, Mark. That would be great.